In that place, a love for a place was born. He was shown the children's room, and he couldn't believe all the books. They showed him the animated Bible stories that he could watch on the little TV, and he loved it. And they said, "You know what, Tomash? Next week, we are starting an adventure Bible club every Wednesday after school. Would you like to come?" Well, yes, he would. And he came. And he came the next week, but he didn't come by himself. He brought a couple of his friends. And the next week, he brought a couple more friends. And the next week, a couple more. His goal was he was going to bring his whole class to the Adventure Bible Club. Hallelujah. Amen. And, it still baffles me that his grandmother he walked home every day by himself and he was 8, and that she didn't mind. Apparently, she didn't mind. He lived with his grandmother, you see, because his father was in prison for murdering his mother. Tomash's family did not know Jesus. He was learning about Jesus and how much Jesus loved him for the very first time. Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me, and do not hinder them." How marvelous. There was a place right in his neighborhood that had an open door just for him.
Click that next picture. Our libraries are a safe place, a legal place where God is discovered and hope comes to life. Doesn't mean a whole lot to us because we've got so many safe places, and virtually any place is legal for us. Not so much in the cities where our libraries are. Listen to this.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And that's really all of the speech that we needed to play, because if you're in your 40s or older, you know exactly what that speech was about. And if you're younger, you need to ask an older person. That was Ronald Reagan in 1987, on my birthday, in Berlin, in front of the Brandenburg Gate. And if you've been to Berlin and to the Brandenburg Gate, you know that just on the other side of that gate was the Berlin Wall. When Reagan gave this speech in 1987, his speechwriters and his staff urged him not to bring up the wall. If you know anything about Reagan, you know that one of his great desires was to bring down communism. And he pushed for it. He spoke against it at every potential opportunity. And his speechwriter said, "Don't do it here. This is not the time. This is not the place." But he did anyway. And I don't think that very many of us believed that 2 years later that wall would be down. We saw it on TV. And if you stayed up late enough, you saw it live on TV. The wall coming down. Look at this next picture. People... the weather didn't cooperate much, but can you see the determination on this guy's face going after that wall? You all probably know they sell little chips of the wall, or what they say is little chips of the wall, and you can buy that and have it on your desk. Look at this next picture. The world watched as communism fell. I don't have time to tell the whole story, but really, when the Berlin Wall came down, it was a result of a bureaucratic error that there was no turning back from once the word had leaked. The wall came down and the world changed in 1989. And communism began to dissolve. The Soviet Union began to break up. And pretty much everything in Central and Eastern Europe changed. It even changed for us. As the countries began to open up, these former communist countries, every kook in the world saw an opportunity. And every religious nut in the world saw an opportunity, as well as sincere Christians who realized that 60 years or 40 years or 50 years of communism, now it's gone, and it left a huge, huge gap. The founding director of our ministry, Open Door Libraries, Willard Black, he's an 84-year-old man that looks like a 64-year-old man and acts like a 34-year-old guy. Well, my motto is, when I grow up, I want to be like Willard. He spent 20 years before communism fell smuggling Bibles back into Romania and the other communist bloc countries. He would go across the border. He told me that you had to bribe the border guards to get across. And he found out that Marlboro cigarettes and Lifebuoy soap worked better than cash, because those were two things that they just couldn't get. So he spent many years traveling back and forth, Romania and Yugoslavia and what was then Czechoslovakia, other communist countries, where he would meet in secret with leaders of churches and literally underground churches in people's basements. Had he been caught, he could have been prosecuted and then, sent out and never permitted back. If you saw the Bridge of Spies movie, that kind of depicted the temperament of the times. But as the wall came down, Willard was in Vienna. He was walking in the Vienna woods and praying, and his prayer was, "Lord, what do you want to do with this opportunity?" And Willard is a practical, amazing, his view. I told a friend after I'd first met Willard, it's like I'd been watching life on a 7-inch black and white TV, and after being with Willard, I realized that there was such a thing as a 33-inch Panavision. And that's how he lived his life. And he wasn't just thinking about his little pockets of activity. He was thinking about the world. And he felt like God said they need resources. What's the resource they didn't have? Well, pick it. There was 1 million. But the one thing they certainly didn't have was Christian literature. For 60 years, if you go back to 1918, 70 years, communism had banned Western literature. Not only could you not have Max Lucado, you couldn't have Mark Twain. Western literature was illegal to own, and Bibles and Christian literature were highly illegal to own. And so Willard realized that as the world changed and as these former communist countries began to experience freedom, one of the things that his organization could do was to bring these resources to bear. And so he thought a library, a lending library, a legal Christian lending library in the capital cities of as many of these countries as we can figure out. And so he began to run with that. And the first city, look at this next slide, the first city was Prague. See, we have We have 3 cities, Prague, Berlin, and Budapest. These are all capital cities in their nations. Our first library was in Prague. And it was established almost 20 years ago, not too long after the wall came down. Now we'll go to the next slide. Prague is an amazing and beautiful city. If you ever get to go to Prague, you should go. A friend of mine who's a world traveler says Prague is Paris of the East. And it is a gorgeous city. It's on the river, and that bridge is called the Charles Bridge. It's an ancient bridge, 1,000 years old. Look at the next picture. One of the things that's happened in the last 12 or 13 years, Debbie and I were in Prague in 2003, and we crossed the bridge, and we could take a leisurely walk. There were artists, there were musicians on the bridge, but you could just get through. Well, I don't know if you can see well enough, but that's a picture of us walking across the bridge. It was like Disney World, where you're just bumper to bumper and shoulder to shoulder. The West has found out about Prague, and now it's a destination. We have a library in Prague. Look at this next picture. Part of Prague's heritage, it's an unfortunate picture that there's a bird resting on the head of John Hus, but in English we say John Hus. In the Czech Republic, it's Jan Hus. 100 years before Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the Wittenberg Castle church door, John Hus began a religious revolution in Prague against the Catholic Church and the Habsburg Holy Roman Empire. It wasn't a military revolution. It was a spiritual revolution. Huss's idea was that the Bible could speak for itself. And the Habsburgs burned him at the stake because he was so effective at spreading this word. To me, it's very interesting that one of the first reformers in all of church history was from Prague. Because today, in Prague, the number of people who are evangelical Christians is 1% of a 10.5 million population in the whole country of Czech Republic. They say that about 10% claim to be Catholics, and of that 10%, about 50% attend masses. The rest are either atheists or agnostics. One of the interesting things that happened during the communist reign, it was nearly 50 years in the Czech Republic. One of the interesting things there was that atheism was not just an option. In America, you have the option to be an atheist if you want to be, right? And we're experiencing a whole revolution of new atheists. If you're not aware of it, it's probably worth getting in touch with. Well, in the Czech Republic, from the time a child was in preschool, and virtually every child in any city in a communist country was in preschool, because the communists understood that if they can indoctrinate a child early, he will be a communist for life. And so they began early. And one of the points of indoctrination was that we have a religion. It's called atheism. There is no God. Now bear in mind, 3 generations who have been raised from their first educational experience through their adulthood to believe that there is no God and to choose atheism as their religion. Not just another option for your belief, but this is my religion. 3 generations go through this indoctrination. Now today, an interesting thing is happening. There are more and more of these atheists that are becoming agnostics. And you realize the difference between an atheist and an agnostic is that atheist says there is no God, and agnostic says, well, I'm not so sure. That's a movement. And although it's not the end, that's an important signal that people are moving away from this virulent, adamant atheism to, well, I'm not so sure. And although it's a tiny segment of the population, 1% are what we would consider, evangelical believers. That's 1% that didn't ever used to be there. And the church is beginning to take root. Our library, go to that next slide. Our library, the Prague Christian Library, and it's Praha. That's all if there's a language more difficult on the planet than Czech, it would be Hungarian. Neither of those 2 languages use enough vowels. There's a whole lot of apologies to Czechs, but I couldn't. We got on the subway, and they announced the stops. And they just should have put on want, because that's all I could understand. Anyway, this is the sign on the front door, by the front door of our library there. This is the smallest of our 3 European libraries, but it's the first that was established. Look, let's go to the next slide. The second library that was established was in Budapest. I got to be on the trip in 2003 where we selected the site for the library in Budapest. Budapest is also a very beautiful ancient city. That's the Danube River. And the large building there is Parliament for the Hungarian government. Prague is the capital of the Czech Republic. Budapest is the capital of Hungary. Look at the next slide. Budapest used to be two cities, Buda and Pest. And the Danube River separated the two cities. Until in the late 1800s, an enterprising Englishman built this suspension bridge, and it became Budapest. So if you ever get to go, you want to make sure you go across the bridge to the Pest side. It's very beautiful. Buda is flat and Pest is very hilly. Well, our library is on the Pest side. Hit that next slide. That building, well, there's my lovely wife. She could be singing, "The hills are alive." Anyway, that building on the second floor, 2 flights up, is where the Budapest Library is. Now, something to know is that just across the street is the Danube River. And if you turned, as you come out of that building, if you turned right, 2 blocks down is the National Technical University. It gets tons of traffic. There are two tram sites, 2 stops, 2 bus stops, and just you see where that van door is open, right? There's a stairway there and it takes you to the subway. You can get there literally from anywhere in Budapest in just a couple, 3 minutes. It's a pretty amazing location, and it's the largest of the 3 of our European libraries. Let's look at the next slide. What's funny to me is you don't have to be able to read Hungarian to know that top guy is what? A dentist. I have no idea what a Romania, whatever that is. I couldn't tell you, but the middle one, I can't pronounce it, but it's the Budapest Christian Library. And there is, in this building, it's like you would take a very large 3-bedroom flat apartment, and we made it into a library. Look at this next slide. Pretty much wherever you look, there are books, wall to wall. If there's not a window, it's got books in it. Look at the next one. We offer a good place, a quiet place, a comfortable place for reading and study. Theological students use our library in both all 3 of our cities, in fact, for theological studies, because we have as good a theological library as they have in their seminary library. And we inherited the library of a small seminary in Budapest, and so we really do have the best theological library in Hungary. Look at the next slide. If you were a kid, would you think you kind of like the kids' room? Oh, okay. I would. I guess you have to have that temperament, but tons and tons and tons of books. This is the room that they do their children's ministry in. Debbie got to work with our friend Claire, who is an assistant at this library and whose specialty is the children's hour and the children's programming. Let's go to the next slide. Berlin was the 3rd library established. I'm very happy, and I hope it's okay to be proud about the right things in the right way, because I only want to be proud about this in the right way. But our middle daughter, Katie, was the founding director of this library in Berlin. She found the site. She arranged to get it right. She began the library, and she was there for 3 years as the director of the Berlin Library, which we call Connections. Let's keep going here. By the way, that was the Brandenburg Gate. Part of the wall still survives as a monument against the oppression of communism. This is our friend Anya, who grew up in East Germany until she escaped and came to the States and met my good friend Jack, and they married. The wall now doesn't seem threatening. It's really just a canvas for graffiti, but it dominates still the post-communist mentality that I don't think Americans get very much. I mean, it's hard for us to get our hands around it. When the wall came down in '89, I think most Americans said, "Great, now you're free. Go act like free people." They didn't know how to. It's not the same. It's a teeny bit similar to when the slaves were freed in America. At the end of the Civil War, saying to a slave that had for 5 generations been in slavery, saying to them, "Now you're free, go act free." They had no idea what that meant or how that would happen or what it would look like. And something similar happened in these post-communist countries. You know, Germany is a very interesting post-communist country because it's a little bit skitsy. You had West Germany that's remained free after World War II, and then you had East Germany that Stalin took at the close of World War II, and then you had a portion of Berlin that had this wall around it. It went up in a weekend. Can you imagine? There were families that lived in West Berlin, or what is called today, well, now it's all Berlin, but before communism fell was West Berlin. They went to what was then East Berlin to visit Grandma on Friday. And on Sunday, when they tried to get back, they couldn't get back because the wall was there. I've never had anything like that happen to me. It's hard for me to relate to that, but that happened literally thousands of times to thousands of different families. Hundreds and hundreds of people were killed trying to cross no man's land and get out of East Germany into West Germany. They used some of the most intriguing ideas for getting out. One of the ideas was that they took and dismantled most of a car, especially the floorboard of a car, and they made like about that much of a false floor, and people would lie down in that, and then they would put the plate back up so that when they drove through a checkpoint, they would put mirrors underneath, right? And they couldn't tell that in that false floor there was 1 or 2 or 3 people, barely enough room to breathe, but they took the risk. Some of them escaped. There are little rabbit monuments today you can still walk the perimeter of the wall, and as you walk along you'll see rabbit monuments, and they represent this is a place where somebody escaped. But hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people were machine gunned down in their attempt to escape. So there's that in the consciousness of Berliners and Germans as a whole. Next slide. This is connections. Now I thought about doctoring the picture up because you see the graffiti, you see the tiles messed up. What happened is a drunk driver nailed the corner of the building, and Connections doesn't own the building. The landlord said, "Yeah, I'll get to that." You ever hear that if you have a landlord? Graffiti is so common in Berlin that we took a work team over twice from Canyon Ridge in Las Vegas, and we got rid of all the graffiti. And one of the times that we did that, we came back the next day and it already had new graffiti on it. You just can't hardly keep up with it. They considered an art form. But these are the front doors. Click the next slide. It's a library, books everywhere. It's the second largest of the 3. But it's not as large as the Budapest Library. It, though, has an interesting story on lots of levels. Let's look at the next slide. There's the most beautiful girl in the world working with the books on the shelves. And the next slide. One of the things is they have the commercial espresso machine that almost is never silent all day long. Because people come there. All 3 of our libraries serve coffee, but our Berlin library is set up to serve coffee in this way, thanks to my daughter Katie, who saw that as a value. Because the name Connections tells you a little bit about the mission. We want to connect people with God and with believers and with other people. And so the environment is a very connecting environment. Let's move to the next slide. Can anybody read what those... Because if you can, you could have a particularly special ministry. These are Hindi, Farsi, and Arabic Bibles. And here's why. You know, if several months ago now, the refugee crisis in Europe got the headlines in newspapers and on the newscast. Now it's been demoted to Facebook. But it still is, there's a conversation going about refugees. Berlin was the destination for nearly all of the refugees coming out of the Middle East. And yes, there have been some very bad things happen by Islamic extremists. But I think the media has done, one of the things that media does great is finding bad things and blowing them up. What we saw while we were there, we never felt threatened, and we were in a Turkish neighborhood in Schönenberg. We never felt unsafe. In fact, go to the next slide. Debbie, come and tell a story.
The Berlin Library was really a happening place. I was not prepared for the level of activity and the number of people that would be there on a daily basis. And on this particular day, on Thursday, it was crammed full. And lots of laughter. You could hear, I could understand it, but I know there was, good jokes being told. There were people in every room doing different things. And then I started really looking, and the director pointed out some things to me. Who would ever guess that the young 20-something girl with her cup of coffee, working on her resume, just right over there, had just fled Syria with her sister, not because of the war, but because she was a Christian and the Christian persecution there? Who would know that all these kids in the biggest room in the library that are teenage boys were from Afghanistan, there in Berlin without their parents? They lived together in a hostel and had gotten connected with a German Christian organization that was helping them. They found them jobs in a factory, and they got them in school, and they come to the library 2 times a week, once to have a sewing class, because their job in the factory is sewing. But when they come to the library, they get to sew and make anything they want to just for themselves. The other time they come during the week is for a homework study group. And I thought, who would know that if you just walked in? And then in the smaller room in the library, there were 2 men. One, obviously the teacher, the other the student. Who would guess, who would imagine that this was a young man from Syria? He was studying the Bible with his teacher, and the curriculum was finding Jesus in the Bible, in the New Testament. He was studying it in Arabic, and he was such a humble, serious young man. But he was staying later that day because his wife and his father both had been killed in the war. He had to flee. His baby daughter stayed in Syria, was living with his mother. So he could use the library computer and the phones, and he was going to Skype and get to talk to his daughter. Who would know? Who would guess? Who would imagine when you just walked in and heard all the talking and the laughing that that's who these people were?
A lot of talk, rightfully so, in the mission world has been about the 1040 window between the 10th parallel and the 40th parallel. There are more unsaved people than in any other window on the globe. And many churches and missionaries have focused in on places like India, Turkey, Afghanistan, countries that are dangerous to be there in order to try and take the gospel there, which I think is a right thing. But what we discovered in Germany is the 1040 window has come to us. And not every one of these refugees dreams of going back home because home has been blown up, it's been destroyed. But many of them desire to go home. And when they go home, we want the seed of the gospel planted in them. The weekend before we got to Berlin, which was our first stop on our trip, 3 of these young men had been baptized that Sunday, which to us, 3 baptisms, whoopee. But when you consider all of the obstacles and all of the hurdles that had to be crossed for these young men to come to Christ, it's an amazing thing. Look at the next picture. This was the sewing class. Next. You can tell food has almost always been a part of this. One of the things that is universal is when you put food on a table, people will gather and they will talk. It happens there too. Next. Books. Books. We believe books change lives because ideas change lives. And the primary idea that we want to carry is that Jesus is the answer. Whatever the problem or whatever the question, Jesus is the answer. In a real sense, books are our excuse for carrying that idea. Next slide.
A thick steel cable was all that stood between Nick Wallander
Ooh, that's a view there, buddy.
and the bottom of the Little Colorado River Gorge near the Grand Canyon. With no safety harness, he relied on his training, self-belief, and the power of prayer.
Praise you, God. King, praise you. Praise you, Jesus, Lord.
The 34-year-old comes from an eminent line of high-wire artists that stretch back 7 generations. As winds whipped around him,
Winds are way worse than I expected.
causing the cable to sway, he paused and simply crouched down. Despite the risks, Nick says he has dreamed of doing this since he was a teenager. It took him 22 nail-biting minutes to make the crossing. Towards the end, he felt confident enough to kneel, blow a kiss, and even run.
It was way more windy, and the movement of the cable and the sidewalls as I was walking were getting in the way and confusing me as the pendulums were swinging against them. So I'd try to react, and when I reacted, I'd kick that rhythm into the cable, and it took every bit of me to stay focused that entire time.
Nick Wallander has no intention of remaining on terra firma for long. He told reporters that he hopes his next stunt will be a tightrope walk between the Empire State Building and the Chrysler Building in New York. Jane Francis Kelly, BBC News.
So why would I show you a video of Nick Walesa? Well, 2 reasons. Number one, did anybody get to see that on TV when it happened? Good. I'm glad you did, because you'll want to tell your kids about that when you get to be a daddy. Here's why I wanted to show you that. 2 reasons. Number one, I think it's worth saying Nick Walesa is not just a daredevil, but he believes that his work creates a platform for him to talk about Jesus. You heard him praying as he walked across that. I mean, who in their right mind would not be praying as they walked across the Grand Canyon? But this is because that's who he is. Second thing is, do you remember that one shot where the camera was on him and then it hand back, and he looked like an ant on a wire. It was down in the canyon. I think that is what the directors at our 3 libraries in Europe often feel like. No net, no tether. It's one thing for me to say, Larry, I'm as close as your email. And that's really not true. My email is as close as your computer, but I'm 5,000 miles away. So when his mom died, everybody in his net were across the Atlantic Ocean. His wife, Terry, her mom and dad both are dying of cancer. They're leaving on the 29th to fly back to Florida and have 3 months in the States. But, I mean, what do you do when you've got those kinds of things? Well, what Debbie and I get to do is be a tether. We get to be the net. At least 3 times a year, we're going to each of the libraries, and our single objective is to care for the staff of the libraries. I have 42 years of experience caring for people and a master's degree in human relations, and doesn't make me an expert, but between Debbie and I, we know how to take care of people and how to encourage and love. So there's a lot of coffee that we drink. We take them to meals. We get them out of their position of having to direct the library 24/7 so we can help them focus on their own heart and soul. And I consider that one of the great privileges of my life. See, I have 2 full-time jobs that I work half a year each. I am a full-time employee here at Cornerstone Community Church, and I love what I get to do here. But I do it 26 weeks a year. My other full-time job is Debbie and I are the international directors, resource directors for Open Door Libraries, and I love that job. I'm doing my dream job. I get to care for you and be loved by you, and I get to care for these directors of our libraries. I don't know how it could get better than that. And like they pay us for that. Now, the way they pay us for it is we go out and raise our support. But God's taking care of us. He's given us this job, and He's taking care of us. Debbie's going to be at the back, out in the, do you call that the narthex? Do you call it the foyer? Is that the lobby? The foyer. Yeah, foyer. She's going to be out there, and we've got these little cards and things that if you'd like to talk to us more about our ministry, we would love to talk to you and go get coffee or meet you somewhere and just share a little bit more, because as many words as I've used, there's that many more to help describe what goes on at our libraries. And the last thing is we're so grateful that our relationship with you is such that you're okay with us being gone half the year, and that you're praying for us and you're cheering for us, and we're so grateful for that. And on July 22nd, when we have to move out of this house we're in, you're going to help us move, and we're really grateful for that. So I'll be talking with you about that, okay? But okay, that's a lot of words, and I've gone over time, but I'm just grateful that we had the chance to share our ministry and our mission and our passion with you guys today. Can we stand up? And I'm going to offer a prayer and ask the worship team to join me up here on stage.